Thanks everyone for joining our second Budget Beat call of 2017. This is Julie Watts, and I'm the Deputy Director at the Washington State Budget and Policy Center. As you all know, the legislative session kicked off on Monday of this week. Today on Budget Beat, we're going to talk with members of our fiscal policy team about the current conversation in Olympia on funding basic education and meeting the Supreme Court mandate to comply with the McCleary decision. We will also talk about how state policymakers can ensure that the state has the resources necessary to fund state services, while also working to fix our upside-down tax system. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the Budget and Policy Center, we are a research organization dedicated to advancing the prosperity of all Washingtonians. We host these calls throughout the legislative session to provide relevant information and news on Olympia. Given the significant potential impact of federal action on Washingtonians, we will also be using these calls to keep you updated on federal policy developments as appropriate. A few quick housekeeping notes before we jump in. There are a number of people on the line, so we have muted all lines to avoid background noise. If you have any questions for us, please send them to us using the chat function on ReadyTalk. We will respond to as many as we can during the call. We will be recording this Budget Beat call, which will also be posted on our website soon. So as I've said, the focus of today's call is on the conversation in Olympia on funding McCleary. And we will also share our revenue proposal and other proposals on the table this legislative biennium. First, we are going to hear from Kelli Smith, who is our key policy analyst following education funding. We will also hear today from Nicholas, our Associate Director of Fiscal Policy. So let's jump right in. Kelli, a lot has happened in Olympia on education funding already this week. So tell us what we're hearing from state policymakers.
Sure, thanks a lot, Julie. So as most of you know, the issue that will dominate the legislature's attention this session is school funding. You probably also know about the McCleary case, which is the 2012 state Supreme Court case that found that the legislature was unconstitutionally underfunding our basic education system by relying too heavily on local funds and not providing enough state funding to cover the basics. So where are we on school funding in McCleary now? What we know is that the legislature has until September 1st of 2018 to fully fund education under McCleary. But the Supreme Court has also made it clear that the legislature must have the plan, including the funding sources, in place by the end of this legislative session. So since April, the Education Funding Task Force, which is a bipartisan group of lawmakers created by Senate Bill 6195 last year, they've met monthly to explore what's left to do on McCleary and make specific recommendations about how to finish the job on school funding during this session. Senate Bill 6195 also directed them to make recommendations in 9 specific areas. We'll go over some of those in a minute. So on Monday, after 8 months of meetings, the task force held its final meeting just before the legislative session started to make its final recommendations to the legislature. Unfortunately, the task force wasn't able to reach agreement on a unified set of recommendations. So instead, what we got were 2 minority reports, and you won't be surprised to hear that one came from the Republican members and one came from the Democratic members. So the Democratic members actually produced a set of recommendations, which is what was required in the legislation. The Republican members produced something they called a set of guiding principles. So I'm going to go through a few of the areas that questions that they grappled with and outline what each party's members came up with. I'm not going to go through all 9 of the issues, but if you have questions about those, please go ahead and put them in the chat box and we'll see if we can address them later. Okay, so the biggest question the task force was asked to answer was around state funding for staff compensation and the state salary allocation model. The Democrats' proposal scraps the current salary allocation model and replaces it with a new one, which basically allocates state funding based on an average market rate cost for each of the 3 types of staff. So that's teachers, administrators, and classified staff. Each of those areas gets a pay bump under the Democrats' plan. Notably for new teachers, the beginning salary would be set at a minimum of $45,500, with a guaranteed 10% raise after 3 years of experience. The new model would be phased in over 3 years, and it includes 6 days of professional development at the beginning. The Republicans agree that beginning teacher salaries should be increased, but they weren't specific as to how much. Their guidelines did emphasize that the legislature should basically adopt a compensation policy that retains local flexibility so that local districts can tailor to unique needs such as cost of living, teacher attrition rates, and economic and demographic realities. Secondly, the task force was asked to make recommendations for local maintenance and operation levies, their M&O levies. And the question here was basically, what are we going to do about the upcoming levy cliff? So for those of you who don't know about the levy cliff, the situation is that right now, school districts are allowed to raise a certain amount of money for schools through their local levies, and it's capped at a percentage of what they receive from state and federal funds. So that's what's called the levy lid. Because of a temporary increase in the levy lid a few years back, right now most districts are allowed to raise 28% with local levies of what they get from state and federal funding. But that's set to expire this year, so in 2018 that percentage is scheduled to go back down to the 24% lid. So that's going to create major problems for many school districts that are writing their budgets for the next school year, essentially. So the Democrats' proposal is to lower the levy lid down to 24%, which is what's currently in law, but they would do so gradually between 2019 and 2021. The Republicans stated that they prefer a local levy system that promotes equity among districts, but they didn't give a specific plan about exactly how to get there. Either way, Senate Bill 6195, which is the bill that created the task force, requires the task force to basically decide by April 1 whether they think that the legislature is going to fund teacher salaries by April 30th, and if they don't, that the legislature should extend the current levy policy for 1 year. So we'll see how that shakes out given how well the task force has worked together so far. One of the other areas that they were asked to make recommendations around was to clarify the difference between basic education and local enrichment. So if you've been following McCleary, you know that the issue is basically that we have basically 2 categories of spending in education: basic education, which the state is required to pay for and not local levies, and then we have sort of extras, which are called local enrichment, and those may be paid for by local levies. But it's necessary basically to clarify the difference between the two so that we know that the right money is paying for the right things. So the Democrats propose adding the following to the program of basic education beginning in the 2019-2021 biennium. So they would add the requirements of Initiative 1351, which is reducing class sizes down to a 19-to-1 student-to-teacher ratio. They would include more support for the Learning Assistance Program, transitional bilingual instruction, special ed, and the Highly Capable Program, and they would include increased investments for guidance counselors and parent involvement coordinators, all in the program of basic education starting in 2019. The Republican guidelines agree that the legislature should clarify the difference between basic education and local enrichment, but doesn't specify how. They do offer a suggestion that the legislature could come up with a list of acceptable enrichment activities for districts and a process for adding new ones, but didn't speak much about what should and should not be in basic education. So one of the main reasons that the state has had such a difficult time determining how much and which programs local levies are paying for and which are being paid for by the state is that school districts don't actually report their spending in a way that identifies what money goes to which program. So they don't have accounting that says this extracurricular activity was paid for by a local levy and this program of basic education or teacher salary was paid for using state funding. So basically the task force was asked to make recommendations around how to clarify that. So this is the area where we got the most detail from the Republicans' proposal, and they would basically add some requirements onto the school district budgeting systems to clarify the accounting. So they would require local districts to segregate their local funds from state and federal funds and actually keep them in separate accounts. and include the source of revenue when they're doing their district accounting so that we can actually see where the money is coming from. The local school districts would also be audited by the state auditor to ensure compliance with these accounting practices. The Republican proposal would also require local districts to include a 4-year budget outlook as well as a 4-year enrollment projection as part of their annual budgeting process. The Democrats' recommendations were a little bit more general. They recommended creating a more robust accounting system and promised to work with school districts and OSPI to accomplish that. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, the task force was asked to come up with sources of state revenue to pay for all of the investments that we need to make in K-12 funding. The Democrats' proposal contains a list of possible sources of revenue that is somewhat familiar to folks who have been following this. It's sort of a repetition of a list that they have released in the past. So the possible sources of revenue include capital gains, closing tax loopholes, changes to B&O and property taxes, carbon pricing, and then requiring some out-of-state retailers to collect sales tax, mostly addressing internet shopping and our inability to collect sales tax on those things. But the Democrats didn't make a commitment as to any specific revenue source. The Republicans maintained their sort of fund education first position, stating that any conversation around revenue should consider repairing the regressive levy structure, but also try to use existing resources. So that suggests that they're not yet ready to, at least to be public about supporting new sources of revenue for education. So in total, the Democrats' recommendations include almost $1.6 billion in new spending this biennium and $5.6 billion next biennium, with a great majority of that spending going towards staff salaries. I should also note that the Republican members said during hearings on this issue that they were waiting on more data, which should be available by February 1st before making more specific recommendations for their part. But in the end, the task force still didn't agree on exactly how much additional funding the legislature will need to invest in the K-12 system to comply with the court's order. But hopefully, they now have the data and modeling that they need to come up with those numbers as soon as possible. The most important thing to note is that we will need new revenue. We simply can't fully fund education and maintain current services across our state, let alone make a lot of much-needed improvements without additional revenue. So I'll hand it over to Andy now to talk more about the revenue proposals on the table and to talk about the Budget and Policy Center's recommendations for revenue this session.
Thank you very much, Kelly. It was a really succinct, good overview of the situation that we face in terms of where we need to go on the spending side of the state budget. And I'm going to go through very quickly the governor's proposal for raising additional revenues to pay for improvements to basic education, and then I'll go through a proposal that we've been putting together over the course of the last few months. So Governor Inslee came out with a bold proposal, and that has been called bold by a number of commentators across the spectrum, and it really is. And there is much to like about this package, and much that we have said would be a good, equitable, and sustainable way of raising additional revenue. Overall, he proposes to raise $4.4 billion for the coming biennium in new revenues. That would be done by establishing a new tax on high-end capital gains above $50,000 for a married couple or $25,000 for singles, taxed at a rate of 7.9%. It is similar in many ways to proposals that he has put forward in the past and that we have been promoting since late 2011. The major difference in this case being that he proposes a slightly higher rate of 7.9%. He also proposes to increase the B&O, or the business and occupation tax, that is applied to services. So that ranges from everything to architects, to accountants, to attorneys, but it also includes sports instruction, hair salons, barbers, anything that can be thought of as a service rather than making or wholesaling a tangible good or product. He proposes to increase that rate by 1 percentage point to 2.5%. That is the rate that it has been in the past. In the mid-90s it was that rate, but it has since been reduced significantly by the legislature. He also proposes to close several tax breaks. I can talk about some of those during Q&A. And then a new carbon tax set at $25 a ton, which would rise annually by 3.5% plus the rate of inflation. We took a somewhat different approach. Again, I'd say that we have a lot of good things to say about the governor's approach, and we were pleased that he was so bold and willing to push the conversation on revenue with his package. The one thing I would say at the outset is that our proposal is not meant to compete with the governor's proposal. Rather, it is to show policymakers and others that there are multiple routes available when it comes to raising additional resources. And then secondly, that there is going to be a big discussion, or there may very well be a big discussion around property tax reform in this legislative session, and we thought it was really important to come out with a package that's centered around what we think are substantial, real improvements to the state property taxes, and that are not some of these fake improvements like revenue neutral levy swaps that purport to be equitable but don't show in any meaningful way that they are equitable, and raise serious questions about whether or not they would actually raise additional resources for education, and certainly don't address some of the other core fundamental problems with the state tax system that we remedy, or the property tax system that we remedy in our package. So we call this proposal Accountable Washington, and we call it that because were it enacted, lawmakers and Washingtonians would be holding themselves accountable to our kids by generating billions of additional dollars in new revenue for schools and other important priorities in the coming years. We would be holding ourselves accountable to struggling workers, seniors, and families by reducing taxes significantly on those with incomes below $75,000 per year. And we'd be holding ourselves accountable to an economy that supports thriving communities by allowing the legislature to preserve existing investments in healthcare, early learning, community technical colleges, universities, and other things that lead to a great quality of life here in Washington State. But before I get into the nuts and bolts of the system, it's always important to remember where we're starting from as a state when it comes to our state tax system. And what you see on the screen before you, and I'm sure many of you have seen this slide before, but it basically shows just exactly how upside down and backwards Washington state tax system is. The graph shows that the poorest fifth of households in our state pay nearly 17% of their incomes in state and local taxes, while those in the richest 1% pay less than 2.5% of their incomes in state and local taxes. And that means that we have the most upside down or most regressive state tax system of any U.S. state. And so from where we're coming from, one of our primary goals was we are not going to make this system any worse. And so more specifically, let me cover what we were trying to accomplish with this package. And indeed, we had these two primary goals. One, we wanted to rebalance the tax code, and we mean reducing taxes, or at least ensuring that those with incomes with $75,000 a year or less who can't afford a significant tax increase would either see their tax bills decline or at least would be held harmless under this proposal. And then the second major goal that we had was that we have to obviously generate a significant amount of revenue. And this package would raise about $4 billion once all the pieces were fully phased in per biennium in new revenue for schools and other important priorities, largely from equitable sources. And I just want to emphasize, once again, before we get into the specifics, that this would be the most equitable change in state tax history were it enacted. So Accountable Washington would be a big step toward creating a more equitable tax system for everyone, as you'll see in the next slide. So what you see here is the change in taxes as a share of household income under this plan. And what you see is that for the poorest fifth of households, taxes as a share of their incomes would decline by 5.1% under this plan. For the middle fifth of households, taxes would decline by a little bit less than 1% under this plan. But by contrast, under Accountable Washington, the richest 1% would see their taxes increase by about 2.1% of their incomes on average. So we offer significant reductions for those at the bottom and the middle end of the income scale, and ask only a little bit more of those at the very top of the income scale to help fund priorities for kids and future generations. So how do we accomplish this? Well, we raise this $4 billion per biennium by first and most importantly leading with equity, and that's part of our political strategy here, is that we have to ensure that we do not raise taxes on those who can't afford a significant tax increase. And so that means safeguarding middle and lower income households, again, those earning $75,000 per year or less. That's the bottom 60% of households. So we are the bottom 60%. We reduce taxes for that, and we do that in two primary ways. One of which is that we suggest funding the working families tax rebate, or tax exemption as it is sometimes called. Many of you may be familiar with this. It's a proposal that was actually enacted by the legislature in 2008, but unfortunately has never been allocated the funding necessary to get the program up and running. It is a state version of the highly successful Federal Earned Income Tax Credit, or EITC, which is one of the most significant investments at the national level we have in ensuring people stay out of poverty. More people are kept out of poverty under the EITC than under almost any other federal program. And by funding the Working Families Tax Rebate, we can add those benefits here in Washington State, offering what essentially amount to sales tax rebates for lower income working families with children. So that's one plank of safeguarding middle and lower income families. The other plank is through a series of property tax rebates that we call safeguard rebates. And the way these would work, and I can get into more specifics during Q&A if people are interested, is that essentially when, for any household earning less than $75,000 per year, that you would receive a rebate on your property tax payments by the extent to which those payments exceed a certain portion of your income. So your property tax bill rises to a point where it's above 2% of your household income. For certain families, you'll get a rebate check up to $1,500 for the amount that you get back, or for the amount by which it exceeds that threshold. We have different thresholds for different income levels. We've worked really hard on tuning this package to make sure that it fits both within the revenue-raising constraints and to maximize its impact on those at the middle and bottom of the income scale. The big thing to note about this, and that is really crucial, is that it would also apply to renters. Any economist or public finance expert worth their salt would tell you that renters indeed pay property taxes. They pay property taxes that are pushed along from their landlords in their rents. And so under this proposal, we would allow renters to assume that about 15% of their rent is property tax payments that have been pushed along. And in addition to just being good policy, we think that this is the right way to address equity in the state property tax system. And that's a big reason that we put in there, and we want that to be part of the discussion when property taxes come up earlier. And by leading with equity, as we said, by ensuring that we keep middle and lower income households harmless under this proposal, it gives us the opportunity to raise significant additional resources in ways that won't be harmful to them, which brings us to the next plank, which is eliminating wasteful tax breaks and arbitrary restrictions that harm schools. Many of you may be aware that of an initiative passed in early 2000 sponsored by Tim Eyman, and that initiative restricts the amount of new revenue that can come in from the state property tax each year to 1% or the rate of inflation plus new construction. So state property tax revenues can only grow by about 1% per year. And That's way less than the number of new kids coming in classrooms every year, than the costs of fueling school buses and heating classrooms every year. We are leaving about $1.6 billion every year on the table, an amount that's going to continue to grow unless we fix this problem, because of this arbitrary and restrictive 1% levy growth limit. And so we can get rid of this arbitrary limit and reset the state property tax back to its statutory normal rate of $3.60 and get $1.6 billion per year more, all of that which goes to fund schools, because all of the state property tax is dedicated to K through 12 education. So that's a big part of how we raise additional resources under this package. And then we also eliminate a number of wasteful tax breaks and exemptions that simply are not worth what the additional investments in our schools would be worth. And we've identified over $1 billion in wasteful tax breaks, just to name a few: sales tax exemptions on trading in luxury vehicles, sales tax exemptions on oil refineries, sales tax exemption on massage and spa and cable services, cable and satellite TV services, a whole range of things that we simply can't afford given the need for funding a better school system for our kids. So, eliminating arbitrary restrictions and wasteful tax breaks lets us generate a lot of additional resources for our schools. And then the final plank of our package is we begin to rebalance the tax system at the top end by enacting or proposing a new tax on high-end capital gains. Our proposal is very similar to what the governor has put forward in the past and what we have promoted in the past. For those of you who aren't aware, capital gains are simply profits from the sale of corporate stocks, bonds, and other high-end financial assets. Like Governor Inslee, we propose exempting the first $50,000 in capital gains for a married couple or $25,000 for singles, but we feel that we need to generate even more revenue. So we propose a 9.9% rate on capital gains above $50,000. That is the same rate that is levied in Oregon. There is no policy reason why we could not have a 9.9% capital gains tax rate or even higher if necessary. And by going a little bit higher on the capital gains tax rate than the governor did, we're allowed to generate $2.6 billion per biennium in resources for schools, the vast majority of which would be paid by the richest 1% of Washingtonians. And so that's the major reason why we include this in our proposal, is that it would make our tax system more equitable and more dependable in the long run. And so, again, pulling back, just before we sum up, I want to remind everyone that were this package enacted, this would be the most equitable change in state tax history. And just again, the graph that you see in front of you shows that for the poorest fifth of households, they would see their taxes as a share of their incomes decline by over 5%. Under this proposal. The middle would see slightly less than a 1% decline, while those in the very richest 1%, those with incomes of more than $600,000 a year, would see their incomes increase modestly by only 2.1%. Their taxes as a share of their incomes increase by 2.1%. So we can equitably generate $4 billion, again, just to recap, by one, safeguarding middle and lower income families through the working families tax rebate and our safeguard property tax rebates, and that's leading with equity, which we think is really important. We can generate additional resources by eliminating wasteful tax breaks and arbitrary restrictions on the property tax that harm schools. And finally, we can rebalance or begin to rebalance the tax code with a new capital gains tax that would apply almost exclusively to those at the very, or exclusively to those at the very top of the income scale. And with that, that rounds out the overview of the presentation, and I'll turn it back over to Julie.
Okay, thank you so much, Andy. And we've got several questions, but I think we're only going to have time for one of them. The most common question that I'm getting from folks on the call has to do with, given the fact that the political dynamics in the legislature are what they are, Andy, do you think this proposal has any chance of being enacted?
I think that any significant revenue increase faces an uphill battle in terms of making its way, getting past the Senate. That said, I do think that there is a very difficult problem that lawmakers face right now, and it is going to be nigh impossible for them not to start thinking about how you fix the tax system in order to honestly address the the challenges that we face. So while as proposed right now, I think the odds are very low that this exact package would wind up being enacted into law. I think the components of it are really crucial in terms of framing the debate, particularly around property taxes. And again, I want to remind folks that there is this revenue-neutral levy swap concept that is being floated around that would raise no additional revenues for schools, that doesn't address the equity problems with the state property tax in any meaningful way, nor does it address the sustainability problems as an instrument for funding public schools in any meaningful way. We think the property tax changes that we propose would really start to address those problems in an honest and measurable. We can show you exactly how much we would raise and how much we would reduce taxes for those in the middle and the bottom of the income scale under our proposal. So again, I think they're important to have out there to push back against those who think that a revenue-neutral levy swap is the only path forward.
Thank you, Andy. I also want to just thank all of you for being on the call today. If we didn't get to your question on this call, we will follow up with you offline. And I want to thank again my colleagues, Nicholas and Kelli Smith, for participating in this call. We also want to ask all of you to stay tuned to our website, budgetandpolicy.org, for a recording of this call. So you'll always find our new legislative agenda, on the front page of the website. And after you sign off, a survey will pop up on your screen, and we'd really appreciate it if you could give us feedback on the call. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Can I just add one thing that I apologize that we will be rolling out the Accountable Washington proposal through a series of Schmudget posts and fact sheets on our website over the next couple of weeks.
Great. Thank you so much, Andy, and thanks to everybody.